My body was telling me things, but I wouldn't allow myself to put two and two together because I was avoiding being with myself, you know? Yeah. And so I have this panic attack. He comes back. He takes me to my apartment. I take a nap in my apartment. I wake up to my parents in the apartment with this guy. And I'm like, can you get, like, my mom came in. I was like, can you get dad in the room? And he sat with me and he was like, are you having a migraine? Because I had, you know, really intense migraines in my early 20s. And I couldn't like, I felt like I had been bludgeoned, but I couldn't, like, it felt post-migraine. But I was also operating with the like, THC probably leaked in my system and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I don't know. And my dad was like, does your head hurt? And I was like, well, I don't know. He was like, stop, like, does your head hurt? And I was like, no. And he was like, well, early on in your sobriety, you told me that migraines were a panic response. So he clocked it, you know?
Yep.
No bullshitting that guy.
Ever.
That's exhausting.
Not ever, I bet.
Yeah, he has a good bullshit meter. Always has. And I just like felt really overcome with sadness about the fact of this exists in my body, that I can't escape this, that like I just felt really powerless in that moment. And so, you know, I was asking him questions like, you know, was it clear how much weed I was smoking with my ex? Like, did you see that we had a problem? He's like, no, but what is clear is that you build castles around bullshit and you can't believe everything that everyone says. And that just like rang in my head. I was like, oh, fuck, I am building castles around bullshit right now. I know I am. I know I'm ignoring my body. I know, like, you know, and then it became very clear that I needed to break up with this guy.
Yeah.
And so a few days pass. I was like selling stuff on Instagram. This is when it gets funny. And he messages me and he's like, I want that. I want that. I want that. And then immediately sends me $150 before I can even confirm. And I was like, oh God, I have to break up with him. And he just sent me money. Oh my fucking. And I was like, oh, what do you want? Can you talk? And so I ended up calling him and I was like, you know, I just like, I can't date right now. Like I really need to focus on myself. And he took it really well. And then I stayed on the phone too long because I was like, oh, I kind of expected him not to take it well. And I think like to a certain degree, if I'm honest with myself, I was like, well, fuck, like I'm worth getting upset about, you know?
Yeah.
And so I was like, you know, maybe it's like right person, wrong. I'm just talking out of my ass. And I said something like, you know, the quality of, if I'm going to be with a sober person, like the quality of their sobriety matters to me, like and how they work the program.
Yeah.
And he did not like that. He was like, well, you know, your self-righteousness is really unbecoming. And like, you don't want to be a sober person who, you know, has 10 years and like turns people away from the program. And all that matters is that I haven't had alcohol in my belly for 4.5 years. And, you know, basically like, who are you to say?
Yeah.
And all I said back was like, the fact that you have 4.5 years is really inspiring, you know, because it is.
Yeah.
And then he hung up the phone. So he ended up messaging me and was like, hey, like I would love to come pick up the stuff. And I was like, okay, yeah, like what do you actually want? And he wanted this like mirror that was like an eyeball with like a mirror in the middle and then my printer and then some of his stuff, that he, like a shirt and a hat that was his. And so I was like, great, yeah, you can come pick it up. I teach my class. I walk out of the class and I get a message from him and it's a picture of a woman in a bra with her shirt off in his room. And he's like, hey, my friend thinks you're hot. Like I can set you up if you want. Like winky face. And I'm in my head being like, I still have to interact with this guy, you know, like I needed him to get to his shit.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, oh, LOL, like she's hot. Like, do you often have your friends in your room without shirts on? And like, how did I come up? And he was like, oh, well, she's poly. And I was scrolling through Instagram and she saw your thirst trap and now she's interested. Like I can set that up if you want. And I was just like, cool. And I was like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
And so before that, I had muted his Instagram stories and I think that he noticed. And so I was like, what's going on? And I go to his Instagram and it's a picture of her tattoo. And then it's another picture of her tattoo, which is like a woman bent over with her B-hole and her P-hole, like exposed with like an ass cheek with a unicorn on it. So that's one of her tattoos.
Okay.
Then the
Classy.
next, yeah, right. I'm like, not a red flag.
Yeah.
And then the next one is like a video of his like leg under a blanket and like his hand over her breast. And then like the same picture he sent me with a heart emoji over it. And so I was like, oh, he really wants me to know that he's fooling around with stuff. Like
yeah, totally.
Yeah. I was like, okay. And I you know, I just felt like really grossed out.
Yeah. That's super gross.
I don't know. Like I learned a lesson.
Yeah.
And it's that anyone who fools around with a newcomer is insane, usually.
Yeah.
And so it gets better. So I'm like, okay, whatever. Like, he just needs to come pick up his stuff. Next day he texts me. He's like, hey, I'm coming in 30 minutes. I'm like, okay. And so I go down to I have a doorman at the building that I was at. I leave with the doorman. 2 hours later, the doorman calls me and he's like, hey, he didn't pick up the printer. And I'm like, what?
Why? He picked up the rest of the stuff?
So the doorman, I'm like friends with all of the people who work at this building. So basically he came and he picked up the mirror and he goes, I don't want this shit. Threw it on the street on a pile of trash. Then picked up the printer and was like, wow, this is heavier than I thought. Do you guys have duct tape? And then he wanted to duct tape the printer to his bike. And they were like, I don't think you should do that. And he was like, you know what? I'll text Paulina and she'll have to figure out how to get it to me. Then he took the cord for the printer and left.
What? Wow. He's kookaroo.
Yeah. And so it's like, I felt that.
Yeah.
I felt that and I couldn't ignore it. Like, my body was freaking the fuck out.
Mm-hmm.
And, if this was, thank God it was only 3 weeks, like I've been in relationships longer where I felt something was off and stayed for 2 years, you know? And so like at the time I felt a lot of shame because I was like, oh God, like, lo and behold, I had sex and sobriety, exciting day, whatever. Turns out I can still bone, but also like clearly I'm still making crappy choices.
Right.
And I was talking to my best friend about it and she was like, listen, I've known you a long time. That's not the worst guy you've ever fucked.
Right. There you go.
And so like, I just feel
that and it's baby steps, You gotta be so patient with yourself. You gotta treat yourself like you'd treat 5-year-old Paulina.
Yeah.
What would you do if 5-year-old Paulina made choices like that? Obviously, she wouldn't make those same choices. But if she
I'd forgive her. I'd be like,
you'd be
it's
like,
okay.
oh, honey, it's all right.
Yeah.
You have to talk to yourself that way. No shame.
Yeah.
I don't like the word shame.
I know.
Nothing to be ashamed of.
I think often about how you said shame has to do with who you fundamentally believe you are.
Yes, that's right. It's about your value.
Yeah.
And that moment in time is not about your value.
Well, I think the better word for it is embarrassment.
Okay, okay. I'll take embarrassment.
Yeah, because I think I used to say like, I don't feel embarrassed. I'll do anything, and then I'd be drunk or stoned, and then do whatever, and then the next day I'd be like, oh, that was uncomfortable.
I'm
like,
kind of embarrassed,
right? And so feeling the true impact of embarrassment was new to me, where it was like,
because you didn't numb it and move on to the next thing. Yeah.
And like I don't feel as embarrassed now. Now I'm like, that's a crazy story.
Yeah, that's a crazy guy. He unfortunately is unhealthy.
He's not fully sober either.
Yeah, no, clearly not.
No.